live. Wow. Okay. Hi, guys. It's Mark Zickery, Mr. Sci-Fi. And I'm here to answer questions. I'm wearing my work hard and be nice shirt. So I thought that was appropriate for these times that we're living in. And so a lot is happening. We are working on the Space Command episode that we're making during the pandemic, and that's going really well. I learned this morning that Neil deGrasse Tyson is going to be playing himself in the Space Command audio play, which is based on an idea that he suggested to me some time ago. And we're just moving along great. The Ripple Effect, the new episode we're doing during the pandemic, is it's over an hour long already, and we're getting new footage in every day from Christina Moses and Francois Chow and Mike Harney and Nichelle Nichols and Armin Shimmerman and Bob Picardo and Mira Furlan and Doug Jones, on, and plus our regular cast from Space Command. So hi, I see Simon, you're here. Hi, it's good to see you, and we'll see who signs on and who asks questions, because I've decided that this was the time to answer every question about Space Command and everything else that I'm up to. Additionally, those of you who've been following this know that Eric Rodriguez sent this wonderful creature head of the Pisaras, the alien species that we're going to have in the upcoming episode of Space Command, in forgiveness, so that anyone who wants to buy like 2 shares or more in Space Command will get that one-of-a-kind collectible. There's only one of those in existence, and it's a concept creation, so it's pretty amazing. And so beyond that, but I'm here for any questions, any ideas, any suggestions. For those who are new to Space Command, I've been doing it. Well, we initially had a Kickstarter campaign, and that got us the money to shoot the pilot, and we had enough left over to shoot another hour of Space Command. So we're shooting all 12 hours of the first season of Space Command while pitching the show. So Space Command is I just posted under the title, The Greatest Star Trek Series You're Not Watching, the first hour of the show, the completed hour, which we've been working on for some time. In terms of when we can expect the next episode, Ripple Effect, which is the one that I came up with this idea of doing an episode of Space Command during the pandemic, where our actors would actually shoot their scenes in their own homes with their own cameras. And I reached out to our cast, and our regular cast: Ethan McDowell, Brian McClure, Justin Servillo, Jacob Waddell, Aaron Gaffey, etc. They all said yes, as did our stars: Doug Jones, Mira Furlan, Bob Picardo, Nichelle Nichols is in it. Mike Harney, Christina Moses from A Million Little Things, Neil deGrasse Tyson is going to be in the prequel. Francois Chow, who plays Jules Pierre Mao on The Expanse, is in it as well. And so basically, it follows several families over 150 years as we colonize the solar system and jump to the stars. But that's just basically the underpinning of the story. It's a big story about compassion, moral consequences, all sorts of stuff, and the ripple effect from generation to generation. And so in terms of Ripple Effect, the new episode, the one we're doing during the pandemic, we should have that ready to debut in about, I don't know, maybe 3 weeks, something like that. And now where that goes in the chronology of the episodes, because this is one I just thought up a few weeks ago, literally like 2 or 3 weeks ago, and then Elaine and I jumped in and wrote it. Elaine had a great inspiration, which was there's a wonderful book and play called Spoon River Anthology, which is about a small town, and people say these monologues about themselves and their feelings and their lives. And she said, why don't we use that as a template for this episode? And I thought, well, that sounds like a good idea. So that's what we undertook. But we're also using special effects, all sorts of things that we can do. So it isn't just characters addressing the camera. There's other twists and turns and permutations. So that's, so that episode, our plan is that we'll have a one-day Space Command convention online in a few weeks, and it'll be live stream, and we'll show our pilot, then we'll show Ripple Effect. Now, Ripple Effect, where it slots in is there's the 2-hour pilot. We're currently working on finishing post-production on the second hour, but then Ripple Effect would slide in right after that. But you can watch it. If you've watched the first hour of the show, you can watch Ripple Effect and know who the characters are and what's going on. And some of the characters are characters who will appear later in the season, like Armin Shimmerman and Christina Moses and so forth. And others are ones you've already seen, like Bill Mummy's character and Mira Furlan and Doug Jones. But because Space Command takes place over a number of generations, then, for instance, Armin Shimmerman plays Robert Picardo's son, or grandson, I guess, Robert Picardo's grandson. So, so I see there's other questions. So if you want to leap in, Adam, and ask some of the questions, that'd be great.
Hi, guys. Adam Sartain here via phone. I'm one of the associate producers on Space Command, and I'm going to be helping read out these questions. So you've already answered Victor Rosa's question of tell us more about the Space Command series.
Yeah, and basically watching the first hour really will tell you what the show is. And it's a 12-hour first season, then it goes beyond that. As I said, Amazon is now actively considering it. But go ahead, Adam, ask another question.
Yeah. Piano Dean has a very good question, which is there a good sci-fi novel you know of that is sort of about what's going on right now for real?
Whew, that's a hard one because it's so crazy what's going on. I mean, there's a lot of science fiction novels about pandemics. I mean, someone mentioned the Andromeda Strain. That's a good one. There's one called Virus that was a Japanese novel that was made actually into an extremely good movie. If you can find it on YouTube, but make sure you watch the Japanese version, which is considerably better than the American version. But it's about a pandemic getting out of hand, and it's good. Contagion, the movie Contagion, is very good. Beyond that, I'm trying to think. It's a whole subgenre of science fiction, sort of the end of the world, and there's many novels. But it's interesting because during the 50s and 60s, most of them were after the bomb stories, and so Canticle for Leibowitz and things like that are terrific. But usually they would have a government that was more in handling its job well, rather than kind of every direction at once. Not to get too political, but these are crazier times than any science fiction novel ever predicted, really. But go ahead, Adam. Yes.
Yeah. Very good. Simon Kennedy has a question. Says you've cut down the first episode into webisodes.
Yes.
But you've added pieces that weren't in the pilot. Can we expect more? I think he's talking about the previews.
No,
right?
not just that. I mean, essentially, we put out an earlier version of the first hour, and then filled it out to be a full hour with the scenes with Doug Jones taking over the alien ship and so forth. And so in the web series, we released the full hour with all of those extra scenes, and then also trailers for 5 more hours of Space Command. But you can watch the full hour. You don't have to watch the webisodes. You can watch the full hour under that title of the greatest Star Trek series you're not watching. I posted the full hour, including Doug on Titan and all of that stuff. And there's
the Battle of Titan that was actually shot back in last August.
Yes, we shot it. We had AJ Wedding helped us with that, and it has my second cameo in the pilot. I get blown up if you look closely. And I'm actually writing a story called Grizzled Space Veteran, Grizzled Space Jockey that links my first cameo where I see Ethan, crash land on Mars with me getting blown up on Titan, and it's the story of how I get from point A to point B, and it's very fun. So I'll release that as a premium at some point, a short story. But but in terms of where we're going from there, we've shot the first 3 hours, not including Ripple Effect, the first 3 hours, and we're ramping up to shoot the 4th hour. And Space Command is structured as 2-hour stories that split down the middle as hour episodes that form a larger 12-hour first season. And Maya Bonhoff has completed the first novel. The audio play prequel is completed. In fact, I got an email this morning from Neil deGrasse Tyson, who plays a role in that prequel, and he's eager to do it. He's going to be sending me the footage today, which is a thrill because it's based on an idea he came up with. And but meantime, we're in post on the 2nd hour, so that'll be released as soon as we finish it. And the 3rd hour, then we'll jump to post-production on the 3rd hour. And as soon as the pandemic is over and we can get back to our studio and shoot, we'll shoot the fourth hour, the second hour of Forgiveness, and then go right into Great Solar War, which is the one after that. The main challenge, of course, is continuing to keep money coming in. So that's where we're going to do another crowdfunding campaign soon. And of course, I announced that anyone who buys 2 Space Command shares, the first person to buy 2 Space Command shares or more at $7,500 each, will get this concept head of our creatures, the Pisara. These are 8-foot tall aliens that will be featured in the next episode of Space Command. And this is handmade by Eric Rodriguez, handmade, hand painted. There's only one There's only one in existence. So if you buy 2 Space Command shares at $7,500 or more shares, so that's 15 grand or more, you get that as well for free, and you'll certainly have bragging rights. And but again, because we have to keep raising money so we can keep doing the visual effects, doing the post-production, and shooting. And so that's what we need to do. So I want to launch another crowdfunding campaign soon. We just raised $57,000, which has allowed us to keep going now, allowed us to keep some of our people on salary, etc., to keep the physical studio open where we're paying rent. So, so the sets have some place to live. But that's, so the real answer is we'll have Ripple Effect. The one we're doing now will be released in the next few weeks. And then after that, the second hour of Redemption, the first hour of Forgiveness, then we'll shoot the second hour of Forgiveness, then into the Great Solar War, and then we'll shoot Empire, which is the one that introduces Armin Shimmerman's character, and then Harvester and Mousetrap. So that, including Ripple Effect, it's a 13-hour season. And our plan is just to keep shooting. And so if we can continue to raise money via our fans, via our audience, or also we're actively pitching the show. So if Amazon buys it, then we're good. So and we're now actively being considered by the entire team at Amazon. So that's a good thing. Another question. Go ahead, please, Adam.
Yeah. White. I hope I don't butcher this too badly. Whiter Gellison.
Mm-hmm.
I think, asks, are there any plans to translate Space Command into other languages?
Yes, there absolutely. And again, we have to figure out the technology of that and get into that conversation. It's interesting. I'm also interested in having Space Command in other languages as for the scenes. So, for instance, Mira Furlan speaks Serbo-Croatian, as does Elena Mergda, who plays her daughter. I'm going to have an entire scene in Spanish in Ripple Effect, the new episode, with Victor Manso and an actor playing his father, who I can't yet announce, but we'll see who we snare. But conversations are ongoing, and so it again. But yes, I'd love to have subtitles in different languages, all sorts of stuff. The more people can watch the show, the better.
Yeah. Now we have one from Doc Sigmir. Again, apologies if I'm butchering this. He says, having seen the first episode in full, it has a real Babylon 5 feel to it,
yes,
which is not bad at all. What
yes.
other influences will you bring to the do you bring to the table?
Well, there's tons. I mean, I'm not called Mr. Sci-Fi for nothing. And but the Babylon 5, of course, is a huge influence because Joe. And I wrote for Babylon 5, but also Joe Straczynski was way ahead of his time in creating an arc story and knowing where the story was going. So that's a huge influence. And of course, the actors on Babylon 5 were so terrific. Mira Furlan and Bill Mumy and so forth. I was eager to work with them again. And so other influences, of course, are Star Trek. I'm going to have a little tip of the hat to Forbidden Planet, a little tip of the hat to Space Patrol, which is the show from the 1950s that I'm a big fan of, even though I wasn't around when it initially aired live. I've seen it in Kinescope, and I met the lead actor and the lead writer of the show many years later. They were wonderful. There's also, I'm just kind of aware of all of science fiction. So there's going to be influences from H.G. Wells. There's going to be influences from Harlan Ellison and Ray Bradbury. In fact, the scene in Spanish that I just wrote has a very specific and very famous reference to Ray's Martian Chronicles that anyone who's read that book will immediately recognize. And again, it's the trick of honoring the past without just ripping it off. Again, you have to create something original, you have to create something fresh, but you also are within a tradition of science fiction that allows you to create something new, but also be part of something ongoing. So it's just like every Western, if you know the genre of Westerns, Stagecoach is going to influence you, Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, etc. moving forward. So speaking of someone who has written Westerns, I was a producer on The Lazarus Man with Robert Urich for a season. So Westerns are fun too. So, okay, but yeah, another question?
Yeah, moving on to Rose Kirby from Jolly Old England.
Hi, Rose.
She says, hello, and I would like to see what Space Command Redemption looks like picture. And I think she's referring to the DVDs, Blu-rays. Do we have designs for the jackets for that yet?
Yeah. This is what the Blu-ray, I think, will look like. It's cool, and but we have to get to where we make those. The problem ongoingly with making Blu-rays and DVDs has simply been that, the quotes we're getting, like $50,000 to make and ship these, is crazy, and that, we can make an episode or a good part of an episode for that. So I have to find a way to lower that cost, or if someone has a CD replication firm or a Blu-ray replication firm and wants to, make them up for us, that would be terrific, because again, I'm always balancing between making the show and making product around the show. And but again, in the next few months, I think we will. The whole idea has been that when we finish the 2 hours of Redemption, we'll send out the Blu-rays and the DVDs. But I wanted, and all the extras, the audio commentaries and behind the scenes stuff and all of that. But it's an ongoing process. But yes, that is definitely the plan.
Right. Let's move on to Ariel Spitzer.
Hi,
says he says it seems CGI doesn't look very realistic. What kind of engine did you use, and did you consider using Unreal Engine?
I've heard about Unreal. We haven't used that yet. CG. There's some CG things that look good, some things that look less good. It's been trial and error. We've worked with so many, Lightwave and Maya and Blender and you name it. I mean, every software there is in terms of rendering and modeling and so forth. We've utilized. We've had people all around the world working on Space Command, and it's been a process of just developing it and seeing what works. I've heard about Unreal, so I definitely will check them out and see if that will help us. There's 900 visual effect shots in the first episode and 900 in the second, and so that's a huge amount. But I'm very pleased and proud of what we've accomplished so far, considering the fact that we don't have a studio, don't have a network. We're just out here on our own, and with our little band of brothers and sisters, and we're doing it.
Yeah. We've got Wilhelm Sowers.
Hi.
Who asked, I think he's referring to Dor Nevin, which is Doug Jones' character.
Yes.
Is Dor Nevin a good guy or villain, or somewhere in between?
Well, that's the question of the story. That's the question we answer in the story. I'll just say this: with Dor Nevin, my whole idea with Dor Nevin was that we as humans are wired where we're still like the monkeys in the trees. We're still just looking at who's part of our group and who's menacing our group and who's the predator out there trying to eat us, and because we're wired that way, we have sort of war is crazy, but we kill each other. We do things that are not sane for the species. I mean, we could feed everyone, we could clothe everyone, we could give everyone homes, we could end global warming just by the determination to end it by stop using fossil fuels and so forth. We have the technology, but because of this wiring, this evolutionary wiring that forces us to do things that are not helpful to our species, we're on sort of almost like on a pre-programmed track because of our wiring evolutionarily. But Dor Nevin, not being a human, doesn't have that wiring, so he's able to observe humanity a step back because he's not human, and he's able to come to decisions that are different than what a human would decide. And compassion is always a very driving force in my work, and I view Dor as a compassionate character. So without spoiling the ending, he's definitely someone that I have a great affinity for.
Great. Moving on to RFSA 180, a very unique name.
Yeah.
Asks, has Patrick Stewart and Kurt's face damaged the Star Trek Prime timeline beyond repair, or do we just ignore it?
Well, everyone evaluates shows and movies and books in a different way. It's always a conversation between everything that they've lived through and what the art piece of whatever it is says to them. And that's why some people will love Picard and some people will hate it, and same with Discovery and so forth. I don't think they've irreparably damaged it. I think of Shakespeare, and Sherlock Holmes and all these characters that have become immortal as incredibly resilient. So you may have a really bad, Sherlock Holmes TV show or movie. Doesn't matter. There'll be another one, and it may be great. Same with Star Trek now. Just like with those Star Trek movies when they would come out every year or every couple of years, and and there's Star Trek V, which is has Uhura's fan dance in it, and good Lord. And then there's Wrath of Khan, which is great, one of my favorite movies. So I'm sure that Star Trek is going to recover. It just needs the right people driving it. It needs the right people making decisions. It's funny because when you look at the showrunners who were the writing staff on the original, on Star Trek: The Next Generation, all of them are showrunners now. And so Brandon Bragg is on the Orville, and and so forth. And Ron Moore did Battlestar Galactica. So they all were reacting to Star Trek and coming to their own creative decisions that made for some very, very good shows. So no, I think Star Trek will find its way one way or another. And the fascinating thing, of course, is within those weak shows, there's the seeds of potentially better shows. So, for instance, the Captain Pike show was certainly offered a greater possibility. The show about Seven of Nine as sort of a bounty hunter kind of freebooter kind of character was really interesting. She was terrific, Jerry Ryan in Picard, and also in Star Trek Voyager. So no, there's great possibility down the line for Star Trek. There always has been.
Great. Okay, moving on to frequent commenter and our dear friend, Mark Lungo.
Hi, Mark. And also, for those who haven't seen my shirt, work hard, be nice. Yeah. So I think important words for these times. But yes, go ahead, please.
You mentioned earlier that Space Command takes place over several generations.
It does.
Will the exact years the stories take place be specified?
Yes. In Ripple Effect, we do that. Space Command starts 60 years from now. So you could say 2080. And then Redemption takes place in 2080. Forgiveness takes place in 2083. We then jump 20 years after that for Great Solar War. So and so forth down the generations. We jump back and forth between generations. So it's very specific, yes. And I wanted to set it far enough in the future where there was a possibility for these things to happen, but not so far in the future that it would be not connected to now. And in fact, the prequel starts 30 years from now, United Planet, and ends 60 years from now. It ends exactly in the scene that the pilot begins, Redemption begins. And and as I said, United Planet is an audio play that we've just completed, and we're also doing it as a graphic novel, and then we're combining the two into what's called an animatic. So it's very fun. And and as I mentioned earlier, for those who weren't there earlier, Neil deGrasse Tyson plays a role in the prequel, and he just emailed me that he's eager to do the role. He'll send us the footage today. So that's a thrill, because he inspired one of the key ideas in that storyline. So it's very fun. But yes, absolutely.
Very cool. Simon Kennedy asks, can we see the Captain Kemmer statue?
Let's see. Well, let me see. This is here. There's a company called Doob that makes life-size, or lifelike figures of people, and but they paint them up in natural colors. That's me. You may see the resemblance in my Space Command jacket and T-shirt. And Ethan, this one of Ethan was natural colors too, but then we took a mold of it to make a bronze statue that figures. It's actually supposed to be like 8 feet tall. It's at the end of the 2-hour story of Redemption, where Mira Furlan and Catherine McEwen walk up to this statue of Jack. So there's one that's metallic that Eric Rodriguez cast and detailed. That's very, very fun, very cool. So can't wait to show you that.
Very cool. Question from Beatmaster. Were you able to make Space Command lemonade out of the pandemic lemons by getting in touch with more talent that is less busy these days?
Yes, that was one of the inspirations for the idea, because I realized that all these actors who are crazy busy all the time, even the ones that I've written roles for down the road in Space Command, they're always, they're shooting shows. Christina Moses, for instance, who I cast as Sulu's daughter in World Enough in Time, which you can watch on Mr. Sci-Fi. She's one of my dear friends, and I wrote a role for her in Space Command that she'll be in. But it was taking me a while to get there, and she, meantime, is the lead in A Million Little Things on ABC. But of course, now everyone's at home. So I started by contacting my friends who are well-known actors and saying, "Hey, can you be in this thing?" And they all said yes. I mean, and including Francois Chow, who's Jules Pierre Mao in The Expanse, because I've been wanting to get actors from The Expanse, actors from Battlestar Galactica, on and on. We're actually reaching out to Edward James Olmos now as well, and of
course, Francois Chow was also in Lost as well.
Yes.
Back in the
Yes. Well, the funny thing was that when I started seeing his name on The Expanse, it rang a bell of some kind. I thought, do I know him? Is he? And I realized finally that he had actually played the lead in one of Elaine's plays about 25 years ago. We did a stage reading of one of her plays, and he was the lead. So I tracked him down online, and I emailed him and said, "Hey, did you star in Elaine's play?" And he said, "Yes, I did." So I said, "You want me in Space Command?" And he said, "Sure." And he's terrific. He's great. So it really super fun. And same with Neil deGrasse Tyson, same with Mike Harney, and then Armin Shimmerman, who I wrote a role for in Space Command. Finally I was able to say, well, can shoot this. And the whole idea with Ripple Effect was that it would allow us to introduce characters or revisit characters and have them talk about themselves, and in some cases, to each other. And we also, the fascinating trick with that was we had to use a lot of different tricks of the trade, because we couldn't use the normal thing. First of all, I didn't want it to bleed the budget from post-production or prep on Forgiveness and finishing Redemption and so forth, and shooting the rest of Forgiveness. So I had to think of something that would not be expensive, but we could do. And because of Zoom calls and all of these things, I started to think, okay, so in some cases, but we wanted it to have variety. So in some cases, it's characters calling each other on video. In some cases, it's them, like, for instance, Barbara Bragg, who plays the ship's doctor in Forgiveness. She's talking at a library, making a tape for kids about what it's like as a career to be a doctor in Space Command, and things go awry. And some of the scenes are funny. Most of them are dramatic. But for instance, it allowed us to use the scene we shot with Nichelle Nichols before the pandemic. It allowed us to use the scene we shot with Nathaniel Freeman and Angelique Scott playing father and daughter. We shot that recently, so we could plug in that. But also it allowed us to use some visual effect shots that we hadn't utilized yet, and also in some cases to use green screen to put two characters together in a shot. And one of the most challenging things, of course, was I wanted a scene with Dor Nevin and a character called Deuce that's also played by Bob Picardo, and because I'd had this in mind for a long time, and I knew that I could send Bob a costume that he could wear for that scene, but we couldn't put Doug in the Dor Nevin thing, because that's not just the helmet and the costume, but it's the makeup and all of that. And so I thought about, well, how could we do this? So I contacted Doug and I said, if you can send us just the ADR of the lines from the scene, we can use green screen shots that we have from when we shot Redemption with Dor Nevin, and we can utilize that, where in some cases he says a word that matches, in some cases it's a look, and we could stitch it together. And we've done that. And Bob Picardo just saw the scene, and he just emailed me back. He said, "Unbelievable," and it's cool, And again, we're magicians doing various tricks in this episode, and obviously it won't have the amount of polish and finish that Redemption has, for instance. But I think people knowing that we're all stuck at home will very much love the idea that we could do this thing. Just all of it. This literally was all of us saying, "Hey, my dad's got some musical instruments in the barn. Let's put on a show." And that's literally what this is. And the fun of having the actors shoot their own scenes, and the fun of having a costume mailed to them or dropped off to them, or we had a worldwide talent search for someone to play Bradbury's daughter, Alexandra, and so an actress in Saskatchewan won, and so she plays that role, and so they're in a scene together, although he's in Atlanta and she's in Canada, and well, no, actually, it was for Essex's sister, so she's in Atlanta, and then there was an actress, Elizabeth Chamberlain, that I liked so well that I cast her as Bradbury's daughter from those auditions. So we got 2 actresses out of that talent search. But again, but this is also something that's very fun, because with the actors who are scattered all over the country and also in other parts of the world, if we were shooting an episode, we'd have to fly them in, we'd have to put them up and pay per diem and so forth. But because everyone's stuck in their own homes, we can have actors like J.G. Hertzler, who played a Romulan general in Deep Space Nine. He's in upstate New York, and yet he can send in his scene. And Ethan McDowell and Brian McClure are in Atlanta, and Michelle DaCosta, who is our development executive, but also has acted in the past, she's in England, and she could send in her. She plays a BBC reporter interviewing Mira Furlan, and so we were able actually to turn these limitations into an added advantage and a strength. So I'm thrilled with doing this episode. It's super fun, and every morning I wake up to getting new footage in, and in some cases, we've introduced new characters that I knew I was going to introduce down the road. So, like for instance, Captains Kemmer and Essex have a son, Ed, and we see him as a baby in the scene with Nichelle Nichols, but then we see him in his early 20s in a scene later in Ripple Effect. And then we see him as an old man. J.G. Hertzler plays him as an old man in this one episode. So because we're covering so many decades, so it's really, really fun, really fun.
Yeah, it's really turning out great. And for those of you who don't know, on our official website, which I've just posted in our comments, there is a special page dedicated to this Ripple Effect episode, including all versions of the script, which we're posting.
Yes.
So you can see the development of it as it goes.
I mean, this is really amazing, because again, about 3 weeks ago, we didn't even have a script, and now we've got a completed script, a full hour episode, and we've got all these actors shooting their scenes, and we have most of it in hand now. The assemblage is mostly, we're waiting for Mike Harney and Christina Moses at just a few bits and pieces, but I'd say we have about maybe 85% of the episode already in hand.
Yeah, that's great.
Phenomenal. Wonderful.
Moving on to Juan Suros, who says, it's nice to see independent stories like yours. Have you ever seen the stuff made by the small studio, The Asylum? They seem to be able to make money with small-scale productions. Any lessons there?
Yes. Well, the challenge with The Asylum, of course, is one of quality. I mean, they make a lot of very bad, but entertaining kind of monster films and so forth, sci-fi films. But my goal is to make low-budget, high-quality science fiction. And so, in terms of their operation, their assembly line operation of that's great, and they do a great job. But but their idea is, well, we have a buyer all lined up so we can knock these things off. But and I'm not down on that at all, because, for instance, that's what was done in the 50s by many, Roger Corman and AIP and all these low budget science fiction movies that many of them I love. But my thought was, since I'm a writer and have some abilities, Elaine and I both, not to toot my own horn, I thought, let's make it quality. And quality is where you have the story have meaning, a meaning that relates to the real world, and you have characters that you care about, and you have wonderful actors, because I've loved so many of the science fiction actors. I mean, many of you know that I met Nichelle Nichols when I was 10, when Star Trek was on the air. It was a dream come true. And to work with her on Space Command now, when she's 87, was just amazing. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity. And so The Asylum, in terms of how it does things from a production side, is impressive, but I sort of like a higher goal in mind.
Yeah.
So
actually, our next question is the flip side of that. Doc Sigmier asks, if you were picked up by a network with a huge commitment to, say, up to 5 seasons of Space Command, would you go back and redo some of the special effects and upgrade them?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Because there's a friend of mine, Mitch Suskin, who's a brilliant visual effects supervisor. He's won 3 Emmys. He worked on Lost and Star Trek Discovery and Enterprise and Star Trek Voyager and on and on. And we've been talking for a couple of years about building an in-house VFX unit exactly like they had on Battlestar Galactica, and it's a small number of what are called generalists who can do everything related to visual effects. And yes, I would go back and I would say, okay, where, and we're going to do that anyway. I mean, if you look at the first hour, I've posted various versions of it over the last year and a half or so, and you can see it going. There are whole sequences where all of the visual effects are completely different, and that's because, again, I'll look at something and say, well, how can we make this better? And because for me, it's a learning curve. It's funny because even though I did hundreds of hours of network TV as a writer producer, I never built a studio from the ground up, and I never built a show from the ground up. The infrastructure was always in place when I came aboard, and so this is a much harder job. I mean, it's also a lot of fun, but in science fiction, you have to basically build everything, and I like that. But it takes a lot of inventiveness, and that'll come all the way from seeing a sofa that someone's thrown out on the street and bringing it home that we use in a scene, to building cool spacesuits and all of that. By the way, we're going to have 2 contests starting up. I'm going to announce them very soon. One is a poster contest where you can do a poster for Space Command, and the other is a spacesuit contest where you can make a spacesuit and send it to us, and we will use it. We've gotten one great spacesuit already that way. And for those who came in a little late, we're still raising money for Space Command. If you want to go on Patreon and throw some money our way, patreon.com/Mark Zickery, that'd be great. Or if you want to buy Space Command shares for $7,500, the first person who contacts me to buy 2 shares or more of Space Command shares gets this one-of-a-kind concept head of the Pisara, which are the creatures, the alien species that we're introducing in the Forgiveness episode. They're 8 foot tall. This was the concept head that Eric Rodriguez sculpted and cast and painted by hand. That it's one of a kind, and whoever buys 2 shares of Space Command or more, first person to contact me with that, gets that head for free. We'll ship it to them. So, but yes, I would. I mean, I would improve Space Command in any way I can, but there's also a sense of moving forward and making sure that we get the entire season. And but yes, there's things I would want to do.
Great. Moving on to Jedi Dalek, who asks, great name.
Yeah.
Who asks, with SpaceX changing the world and Space Force becoming a reality, do you think science fiction television will start to focus away from far future stories and more like The Martian or For All Mankind?
It's an interesting question. Well, first of all, I should say I'm so glad I did not name this show Space Force. That's a bullet that whizzed right on by. The answer to that is, I think for many years it was very difficult to get space-going science fiction greenlit. That was one of the reasons why I did Space Command this way, because I loved what Star Trek had done for me in my life, and I wanted to do something that would be equally inspiring. Now, of course, as I've been working on Space Command, we've gotten The Expanse and Star Trek Discovery and Picard and The Orville. In terms of more recent future-based shows, you'll always get those. They're cheaper to make, for one thing. If you have something set on Earth, you don't have to build everything. But the problem with, if it's like something like by the way, I love The Martian, both the novel and the movie. But to do it well, you have to really put money into it. It has to be technically accurate. That's hard, and so it has to be done well. Because there was a show a few years ago, I think it was called Gravity, or Escaping Gravity, or Defying Gravity, whatever it was. But it was about trainees in a near future, astronaut trainees, and it was okay, but not great. And For All Mankind, it's interesting. I liked it. I thought Ron Moore did a great job. But the problem with it is you get antsy. It's about an alternate space program where the Russians land on the moon, and we then have to continue the manned space program to Mars and so forth. And the first season, they managed to get to the moon. But it's sort of like, okay, let's get to Mars, for God's sake. Let's get to the outer planets. I mean, it's like pick up the pace. But so yeah. But also in terms of Elon Musk, I want to say, I really hope he makes it to Mars. I really hope he's the one to land there first. I hope it's not the Chinese, because I think it'd be amazing. Because all these books I read when I was a kid, like Heinlein, whose books you can see behind me, it was always about some crazy rich guy finances a trip to the moon, and the fact that you have that happening in the real world now is just thrilling to me. And I think Elon Musk is an amazing man. He has his idiosyncrasies. He's not perfect, God knows, but he's, I think, doing real good in the world, and I'm very eager for him to get to Mars.
Very cool. We've got another question from Wilhelm Sowers, who asks, will you ever use physical models for ships in Space Command?
We talked about that early on, and it's possible. The challenge with that, of course, is that you need the people who specifically know how to do that and do it well. And of course, it's an aging population of those people. I mean, they're I mean, for instance, Ron Thornton, whom we brought aboard as our visual effects supervisor, who I worked with on Babylon 5, and he also was on Star Trek, won an Emmy for some of the interim Star Trek series like Next Gen, etc. He fell ill and passed away, sadly, only a few months into our. So he only oversaw the opening sequence before we lost him very sadly. So again, you have to find the people who really know their stuff and really know what they're doing, and so. There you go. So it's possible down the line. It's something I'd like to do, and use miniatures as well. We've talked about it.
We've already been using miniatures for the statues.
Yes.
Stuff like that.
Yes.
Juan Suros asks, will we see delameters or any other classic sci-fi weapons?
Yes. I mean, but mainly if in the backgrounds as a sort of tip of the hat. So, for instance, you might see a Forbidden Planet blaster in a crowd shot or whatever. But everything that's sort of like a hero weapon we'll be designing independently. However, that said, Ed Emshwiller, who is a phenomenal science fiction artist from the 50s, whose work I've always loved, his son gave us rights to use his designs. And so we're using a great ray gun design of his for the blaster in Space Command. And I want to do even more of his designs. He's a wonderful artist and one of my favorites.
Very good. I think we lost the. There we go. Here we go. Matt Milson asks, do you think AFCS will prevail in space too? Their dominance down on planet Earth is incredible.
Yeah, I mean, I assume you mean Air Force Space Command.
Yeah.
Well, I've met those guys and talked to them, and they've advised me and come on the set, and I think they're terrific. The danger of all of this stuff with Space Force is that remarkably, in over 50 years, 60, we have not militarized space. There were fears of nuclear weapons platforms in orbit. In fact, in 2001, when it cuts from that weapon spinning, the bone spinning to a spacecraft, those are all nuclear missiles in space. When you research 2001, but we didn't get that. Thank God we didn't. And I don't want there to be militarization of space. I don't want space wars. We've managed to be collaborative in space, and I think it's vital that we remain so. One of the reasons I think we've been so collaborative in space, despite the race to the moon and all of that, is because it's such an incredibly dangerous environment. It's like the poles, the South Pole and the North Pole. We haven't fought wars there because it's such a dangerous environment that we kind of recognize our common humanity and help each other. I think war in any form is incredibly destructive, incredibly foolish, incredibly outdated. And so I just really want to make sure that we're very, very careful. And again, the internet, all of these things that make our lives so good is so precarious. And the moment you start getting, satellites being taken out and so forth, communication satellites, all of these things, and even getting space junk in orbit where it can damage things, you've got a problem. And so I think, I hope for the best for humanity, and I think collaboration is so much better than confrontation.
Absolutely. We've got a question from Destiny Captain, another great name, who asks, is there any way to get a good clear photo of the Salvage logo on that Salvage team costume from Aliens?
Yes, sure, you bet. We can post that. It's as soon as it gets sent back to me, I'm probably going to put it on a mannequin at my place. It's super cool. When I saw, I mean, Aliens is one of my favorite films of all time, and when I saw that thing come up on eBay, it was like, I just jumped. I mean, I negotiated a price and bought it because I knew I was going to use it in Space Command, and Ethan looks great in it. The scene we have of him in that suit in Ripple Effect is spectacular, and I just love it. I love the connection to all my favorite movies and TV shows.
Very good. Question from Rohan Richardson.
Mm-hmm.
Are you still looking for people to have within the cast? And I'm just gonna tag on to here. When am I getting written into Space Command?
Yes. Exactly. We'll have to find a role for you, Adam. It's yeah. I mean, yes, we are, but and in terms of walk-ons and like one-line things, that's fairly straightforward, and we can do those things. In terms of major roles, of course, it has to be a role that fits what we're doing. So, for instance, when I came up with the idea of doing one scene all in Spanish, we're casting someone to play Victor Manso's fiance, and so I'm auditioning actresses right now for that, and but it's but again, it's specific to that. But beyond that, I'm doing the Showrunners Network, and that's where I'm creating 6 shows with 6 major showrunners: Rockne O'Bannon, Mark Fergus, etc. And in fact, we're going to have a table read, a Zoom table read of Sweet Haven in the next couple of weeks with Mira Furlan, Bob Picardo, all of our leads, Mike Harney from that show, and I've written a role for George Takei. I've written a role for Nana Visitor. I've written a role for Gates McFadden. So it should be pretty wonderful.
Very good. Mark Lungo wanted to know how is that action figure company's name spelled?
It's DOOB. D as in dog, OOB as in boy. And one can actually order a Mark Zickery figurine or an Ethan McDowell figurine. So, but they're not cheap, sadly. But so and very possibly I'll order a life-size one of me in the future, so that when there are meetings I don't want to go to, I can just have that sitting in a chair, and they'll assume I'm just thinking up an episode in my mind, which is why I'm not being responsive.
Very good. Another question from Doc Signier.
Mm-hmm.
Had a question about the reboot of Lost in Space.
Yes.
Any comments on the way it was set up and its pacing as a series?
Yeah, I've started watching season 2. I haven't gotten very far into it. It's half a good show, half not a good show. I mean, it's got goofy stuff. It's like, the teenagers got a date and it's their first kiss or whatever. Who cares? And it's funny that the original cast is much more memorable than this cast somehow. But I think Parker Posey as Dr. Smith is really cool. But of course, they're making her much more of a sociopath than Dr. Smith was in the original show. Will Robinson, Bill Mumy is unforgettable as Will Robinson originally, and I'm glad they brought him back at least in a cameo. The visual effects are just astonishing. It's a phenomenal job from a production standpoint. The robot, I really like the robot design. So it's not a bad show, and I don't want to badmouth it at all. I think it's trying really hard to be a good show, and I think I've heard that the second episode is better than the first. That's great. It's a very difficult premise. Lost in space. Okay. I mean, how many story twists and turns can you do before it gets tiresome? That was the problem with Voyager, also Star Trek Voyager, which is like they're wandering around trying to find their way home. It's basically Gilligan's Island as science fiction drama, but that's okay. But I think the design work on that show, the visual effects, there's a lot to really love in that show, the new Lost in Space.
Yeah, I enjoyed it myself.
Yeah.
Question from Victor Rosa. Which is basically asking, what are your thoughts on merchandising some of the spacecraft and the characters from Space Command?
Well, we have some Space Command merchandise already available. If you look below this, you can get T-shirts and leggings and various other items. Also, we're working on revamping the Space Command store, because we have made patches and posters and T-shirts and jackets and models of the Paladin and a bunch of stuff available, but it's not in a really functional form right now. And so we just have to kind of find someone who's very good at retail and get it to work correctly, because right now it's a little funky. But yeah, we've actually examined all of that stuff and want to do a lot more of it, because it's a natural, of course.
Great. Rose Kirby clarifying her question.
Sure.
What day, dates, time? Is there a specific time set right now for the Space Command convention, the online?
It's probably going to be on a Saturday, about maybe 3 or 4 weeks from now, would be my thought. But that's contingent on us getting Ripple Effect to where we like it. I mean, where it's kind of all buttoned down in terms of visual effects and post. So we still have to do sound, color correction. Again, the trick is to make sure. I mean, all of us are working for free on it. The actors, me, Elaine, and so we just have to make sure that it's, as I said earlier, not draining money from post-production or pre-production on the other episodes. But I find it, and it's a very experimental episode. I mean, I love it. I think it's great. But it's much more characters talking about themselves, characters going into who they are and why they are that way. It's more introspective than a standard episode of Space Command. So it's got less action, less visual effects, but still, I think it's going to really work, and I know it does. And it's, the funny scenes are really funny, and the sad scenes are sad, and it's really cool. I think it's really amazing, and it also sets this. Here's something that's cool about it, which is, if you've seen the pilot, you'll get to see some characters you've already come to really like, and if you watch the entire first season when it's completed, you will see how we set up various characters in Ripple Effect that we pay off later in the season. So it's very fun that way. So I really love that.
Speaking of Ripple Effect, yes. Mark Longo asks, a very good question. Since Ripple Effect is basically being filmed by the actors, who, if anyone, will be credited as director?
Well, Elaine and I are the directors, because we're talking with our actors long distance. We're telling them what we want. Yeah, sometimes they'll send us in a take, and we'll say, okay, here's, adjust it this way. So we're directing it as much as we would direct something if they were physically present. But the real question was who's going to be credited as director of photography. Now Massimiliano Trevis, who's our DP on Space Command, he's been advising some of our actors on how to shoot certain scenes. For instance, Elizabeth Chamberlain, who plays Brian McClure's daughter, we could have her in glasses or not glasses, and the glasses were being too reflective, so Masi had to call her and tell her how you can shoot a scene with glasses where they don't reflect as much, which was very helpful. So but Elaine and I are, every single day, we're in communication with our actors and with our team in general. I mean, Dave Edison, every day he's sending me the edited footage, and we're doing all these tricks where I'll say, okay, let's put in a view screen behind them, let's do this or that, and in fact, for those who've pledged to have long distance walk-ons, cameos, I'm going to contact 2 of them, because behind Captain Matt Kemmer, on the Paladin and later generations, there's 2 people at their stations, and we're going to use 2 of our long distance cameos so they can send video footage of themselves, and we'll put it in, and they'll be on the Paladin in this episode and credited as such. So that's going to be really fun.
Very cool. Another question from Victor Rosa. Are you planning to use any actual footage of space, Mars, terrain, etc. in future episodes?
I'd like to. Yes, I'd like to very much. I have friends who drive the Mars rover, and I love the footage that we're seeing in the outer planets and the moons of those outer planets. I mean, just phenomenal stuff. I mean, it's just So it's definitely something I'd love to do. Absolutely.
Great. Beatmaster asks, as you've mentioned, to pick up by a network would probably bring visual updates. Mm-hmm. What would you say or do when if a network wants different talent on the show? So like a total redo, a no-go? And I think you've answered this before.
And I'm happy to answer this because I've thought about it. Now, fortunately, no one has said anything. All these executives that I've met with and talked to, none of them have ever suggested that. The funny thing is that back when I started Space Command, if I'd asked for a cast that was Mira Furlan, Bill Mumy, Bob Picardo, Doug Jones, they would have said, "Who are those people? No, we want some actor who can't act, who's on, you know, the CW or whatever. But of course, now that Doug's playing Saru in Star Trek Discovery, you know, etc., you know, our actors are getting a higher and higher profile. I mean, Bob Picardo was just in The Orville recently, you know, so and Christina Moses, of course, is starring in a million little things. So Mike Harney's on Project Blue Book, you know, and Francois Chow, as you said, was on Lost and The Expanse. So my actors are getting more and more credits that make them justifiable to a network or a VOD platform. But you know, but my thought was, if they said we want to take a different run at this, first of all, my bottom line is I'm not going to sell Space Command to anyone who wants to make it stupid. Or wants to do something that's different from what I have in mind. If they, you know, you can tell if they get it or not, and that's why the people I've been specifically looking for in the executive hierarchy are science fiction geeks. I mean, Joey Brown, who's my way into Amazon now, he's a science fiction geek. His favorite Star Trek show is Star Trek Voyager. He loves Robert Picardo, so there's no argument from him. I mean, to see a new show with Bob Picardo is a thrill for him. So that's my kind of guy, because he gets it. He understands why you want to do compassionate science fiction, why you want to do science fiction that's hopeful and shows a possibility for the future. You know, he understands. So, but let's say a VOD platform said, we want to buy this, but we don't want this cast. We want, you know, a different cast. What I would do is I would say, okay, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to shoot this series, you know, as I've been shooting it with my actors. I'll just continue this storyline, but we'll create a secondary storyline in the Space Command universe that will be the show that you guys finance. And then I would just take my money, you know, some of my money goes to my investors. And if you want to buy Space Command shares, contact me soon. Amazon's whole team now is considering the show. I mean, and they're just all sitting at home with nothing to watch except this, you know. So so now's the moment to buy Space Command shares. You get a percentage of my producer's net profits on the first 4 hours of Space Command. So $7,500, and if you buy 2 shares or more, you get this concept head of one of our aliens, one of a kind. You get to keep it. It's I mean, that alone someday you'll probably be able to auction for more than 15 grand, just to be real about that.
Oh.
I mean,
especially once it becomes a very famous show.
Yeah. So and again, Eric Rodriguez, who's our art director, he's worked on Men in Black, he's worked on the Star Trek movies, you know, JJ's movies. He's worked on a ton of great science fiction credits. So but going back to what we were talking about, so in that case I would create a secondary storyline, just like with Next Gen and DS9, you know, how they did that, and that wouldn't be hard at all. It's, I mean, in science fiction we create universes, and so that would be what I would do, and but I wouldn't pull the plug on this storyline at all. I would keep it going, and you know, and just make it work. But no one has suggested that, so you know, I try not to worry about things I don't have to worry about yet. So
right.
which has proved very useful in my life.
Speaking of universes, Mark Lungo has a question about the Space Command universe.
Sure.
Does the future Earth of Space Command have a world government?
It has the United Planets, and so it's sort of like different countries will have sort of their own local governments, but they have they're more collaborative and they're working together. Initially, well, here's the basic way I work it. Anson Kemmer, who's Jack Kemmer's father, he's 30 years from now, he's a pilot in the Air Force, U.S. Air Force. During our war in Sri Lanka, he shot down by drone predators and severely wounded. He wakes up in a hut in the jungle, and it's Anoka Chandamal, who is a worldwide peace activist, who has found him and tended his wounds, and she basically brings her into her worldwide peace movement, which is called United Planet, and their motto is sanity at last, which is the idea that we cannot count on all these world leaders with all of their personality problems to solve the world's problems. We as people have to recognize each other's common humanity and rise up to demand sane solutions to all these problems as a species. And so so she enlists Anson, and in the prequel you can see what they do that basically turns climate change around. And that was Neil deGrasse Tyson's idea, by the way. And so then United Planet, the world force overseeing everybody is the United Planet, and then as we go out in space it becomes United Planets as we colonize Mars and the outer moons of the system. And so that's how that works. And but again, you know, it's sort of like the United Nations is better than the League of Nations. The League of Nations between World War I and World War II didn't have any power of enforcement, so they were kind of a tiger with no fangs. But the United Nations has more efficacy, but still not enough. I mean, so ultimately, you'd want something where it could be like if someone is starving, United Planet steps in and they're okay. Or if there's a war about to heat up, they enforce peace negotiations or whatever it is. So it's not a dictatorship, but it definitely brings cooler heads to prevail.
Great. Where was? And now getting into Mr. Sci-Fi type stuff. Simon Kennedy asks, or says, you had a great series of talks about sci-fi novels, like the history of science fiction novels.
Yes, thanks.
Could you do one about sci-fi comics?
That's yes. I have to get back to my history of science fiction. And if you kind of Google on or do the search function on Mr. Sci-Fi, you can see I've done hours of this history of science fiction because I was on James Cameron's TV show, his history of science fiction. And I thought, well, gosh, that's very director centric, and I wanted to do something that was based on the knowledge I had. So having come up in the genre. And so I've done the history of novels so far. I've started the history of film. I've gotten into sort of the mid 60s. I'll finish that. Then I'll do the history of TV, science fiction. And then, I'll do science fiction comics, though I'm not as versed in that. So for instance, I read comics as a kid, and I've read some graphic novels as an adult. I like Watchmen very much, but I'm not as versed in as I'd like to be. So it'll be my history of science fiction comics, will be sort of my favorites, and it'll be a little more spotty than my history of TV, film, books, which I know a lot about, of course. So any other questions?
Yeah.
Cool. We'll keep going for a little while.
This next question, I think you know more about than I think Wilhelm Sauers thinks you know. As not only Bill Mumy is in Space Command, but you know him personally. Is that right?
Yeah. And some of you, some of you know that story. Some of you don't. But I'll tell it here.
Because he asks, has Bill Mumy seen Lost in Space reboot, and what does he think about it?
Well, he's in it. I mean, he played Dr. Smith, the real Dr. Smith. I keep hoping they'll bring that character back, because, I mean, he's a wonderful actor. He's also in Ripple Effect, in addition to being in Redemption, our 2-hour pilot. The way I met Bill was before Star Trek. I was a science fiction fan as long as I can remember. My favorite book when I was 7 was Farmer in the Sky, which is back here. It's right up here. Which is why I have such a love of library books. When they discontinue library books of these Heinlein hardcovers, the juveniles, I buy them because I just love these books, because that's what I was reading when I was 7 years old. And so I was looking for good science fiction TV, but there's very little of it before Star Trek came on when I was 10. I mean, Twilight Zone I didn't get into until later. And so Lost in Space was my favorite show when I was like 7 years old. And one day I was homesick. I had a cold. And, because I was a latchkey kid, my mom was working single mom, divorcee. I was home with a cold in my pajamas and just, alone. And so I decided to look up the stars of Lost in Space in the phone directory. They used to give us, everyone used to get a big, what were called the white pages. And they listed everyone who had a listed phone number in the city, a big thick book. And you got it for free. And so I took out the phone directory and started looking up the stars and calling them. 7-year-old kid. And most of them were just people with the same names, but they weren't the same people. But there was one Mumy in the phone book, and it must have been his dad. So I called, and his mom answered. And I said, is Billy there? And she said, hold on. And Billy Mumy came to the phone, and I was so nervous. All I could say was, I blurted out, will you be my friend? And hung up. But then I called him back. And as soon as I was over my cold, my mom took me over, and he and I traded comic books. And so I've known him since I was 7 years old. And so when I wrote the Twilight Zone Companion, he was in 3 great episodes of Twilight Zone. So I interviewed him for that. So I took photographs of him back when I interviewed him for the Twilight Zone Companion. He also was friends with some of the students at my school. He went to a different high school, but he knew some people I knew. So every now and then he'd show up at our high school, just kind of, taking the day to come visit. And so we'd talk then as well. And then Twilight Zone Companion came out, and that of course went great. And then when I wrote for Babylon 5, he was in that show, and so again we were on the set taking photos with each other. And then when I started being on George Nuri's show, when I started being on with George Nuri, George would have Bill on, and we'd be on the show together. And it was a no brainer that I was going to write him into Space Command. I absolutely wanted Bill in Space Command, and he's in the prequel now, and he's in Ripple Effect, and he'll be in later episodes as well. I mean, he's terrific and underutilized, very underutilized as an actor, because he's totally solid. So so it's a thrill. I mean, it's funny. I still feel a little bit of shyness around some of these stars whose work I love. It's that hasn't worn off really. It's because I feel so honored to be working with them.
Great. Jedi Dalek asked another question. Is there still a market, because you were talking about those books, is there still a market for sci-fi short stories?
Yes.
What is the amazing stories or weird tales of the 2020s? And are there current writers on the level of Asimov or Clarke?
It's an interesting question. Well, first of all, short stories, science fiction, I think, is the only genre still extant where you can still make a name for yourself in science fiction short stories. You can still write short stories and become famous as a science fiction writer. That no longer exists in mainstream literature, for instance. But yes, there's a number of the science fiction magazines are still printing. I think Astounding's still around. I think Asimov's is still around. But there's also online science fiction magazines that are also eligible for the Hugo and the Nebula Awards. So there's one called Clark's World. There's a bunch of them. If you just Google science fiction magazines, you'll find a bunch of them. And that can and if you go to the major science fiction conventions, WorldCon, World Fantasy Con, where the writers go, you can meet the editors, and that can lead to a book deal, and it can lead to a career. So I think those are great. In terms of what writers are, the equals, let us say, of Heinlein and Bradbury and Arthur C. Clarke, I've been thinking about this, of course, because I'm Mr. Sci-Fi. The big difference for me between those guys and the new crop is that they were visionaries. They were proselytizing for manned space travel, manned space exploration. So they were working hand in glove with the rocket scientists to bring this vision of the future to the public. And they succeeded around the world. They made it a world dream for us to land on the moon, for us to colonize Mars, all of those things. When 2001: A Space Odyssey came out, we thought we were seeing a postcard of what our future was going to be. And so they were optimists. They were not pessimists at all. I mean, even though they'd sometimes write an after the bomb story and decried the threat of nuclear annihilation, mainly they were looking toward a great future. Tomorrowland, the original Tomorrowland at Disneyland, was very much the same thing. And so they were all writing in a shared universe of Marsport. It's the same shared universe I'm writing in with Space Command, where you have Marsport and you've got the colonized outer moons of the solar system. You have alien races out beyond that, and so forth. It's so these were great writers. They knew each other and they were sharing ideas. I remember one time Theodore Sturgeon, the great Theodore Sturgeon, who was one of my mentors and dear friend when I was a teenager. I read in the collections of his short stories that at one point in the 1950s, you had to write at a furious rate to make a living because you were getting paid a penny a word, 5 cents a word. These people were not rich at that point, and you can see that world in Far Beyond the Stars, the Deep Space Nine episode I came up with. But Ted Sturgeon ran out of ideas, and he needed to earn a living. He needed to keep writing, and so he wrote to Heinlein and said, "Hey, do you have any ideas? Because I'm dead out, and I just need to get jump started." Heinlein sent him 11 pages of ideas for science fiction stories, which Ted then used and sold them and made a living. And Heinlein never asked for any money or any credit. He was just a really good guy, and they could not have been more different politically, because Heinlein was very right-wing and Ted was very left-wing, but they were all, science fiction fans who became writers. They knew each other and they liked each other and they would help each other. So that's a really remarkable. And I've seen that many times in the science fiction world. But in terms of the new writers, I can tell you the ones I like. I mean, Andy Weir, who wrote The Martian, I think is very good. I think William Gibson is good. I've never really warmed to Neuromancer, but I think he's a talented man. I really like the script he wrote for Alien 3, which you can now watch as an animatic on YouTube, because they did a graphic novel and an audio play of it. It's very different from Alien 3, the movie. Who else do I like? Cixin Liu, who's a Chinese writer, is pretty good. I like Oh gosh, there's one there. There was a writer I met who wrote a book called Six Wakes that I liked. I wouldn't say any of them are up to the level of a Ray Bradbury or a Heinlein or an Arthur C. Clarke. I think these guys were just giants, and you know they were modern science fiction. They're the ones who made science fiction what it was. I mean, H.G. Wells all got them going, you know, and he's of course our patron saint and grandfather of us all. But but I think if I had a chance of sitting down with Arthur C. Clarke and Bradbury and Heinlein, if they could somehow magically be brought back, I would much prefer that than sitting around with the current crop of folks. Though the one thing I will say is I like the fact that science fiction is more inclusive now. I like the fact that we have women of color and transgender and the whole 9 yards, because I think that strengthens the genre. So I'm not down on that at all. And Octavia Butler, of course, was another terrific writer. I read Kindred, liked it very much, and I knew her personally. I've named Nichelle Nichols' character Octavia Butler after her. So yeah, so that's my answer.
Great. Sunny Singhi asks, what are your thoughts on Olaf Stapledon?
He's one of those writers that I'm eventually going to get to. I mean, I've heard very good things about him. I plan to read Star Maker. I plan to read Last and First Men and Odd John. Just haven't gotten to it. It's the same with Doc Smith, E.E. Smith. I know his work, of course, but haven't gotten to him yet. I mean, I'm just trying to write my stuff now. I got scripts to write and books to write and all sorts of stuff. I mean, it's funny, but I definitely. Well, I also listen to a lot of audiobooks. That's one of the ways that I caught up with, for instance, The Star's My Destination, which I really liked. Alfred Bester. But I try to read at least one or two regular physical books at a time. I'm reading, I'll read histories, or I'll read, just things that interest me. Some will be in the genre, some not. But I'm always reading both audiobooks and book books. Always. So.
Very good. Question from Simon Kennedy, or another question from Simon Kennedy.
Cool.
Would you ever cast against type, like Bill Burr on The Mandalorian?
The Mandalorian is another thing I haven't yet gotten into, because you have to subscribe to Disney Plus. But yes, I like to cast against type. I like to mix it up, and often I'll cast someone who's very different from what I had in mind initially. If they're like Justin Servillo, we cast, who wasn't what I had in mind initially, but he's great. Really like working with him. But yeah, and I very specifically look for people of color. I'm interested in I want the universe in Space Command to reflect the universe I live in, and that means all kinds of people. Absolutely.
Great. Cosmic Ape 2 asks about library books. Did you ever find or buy a library book with your name in it from back in the day?
I've bought some library books that were discontinued. I needed a couple of copies of Magic Time Ghostlands, and so I just ordered those. But mainly the discontinued, and I never steal a library book or anything like that, because that's a crime against humanity. But I feel bad that they're pulling the Heinlein juveniles off the racks at libraries, because they're still great books. I love Half Spacesuit Will Travel, Citizens of the Galaxy. These are wonderful books, but so I mainly buy sort of 1950s science fiction books that have been discontinued, or I bought a first edition of Great Gatsby recently that was a library books, because ex-library books, just for those who collect books, first editions, and I do collect first editions, are very expensive unless they're ex-library, and that brings the value way down. They're the same exact book, but if they were in a library, they become a tiny percentage of what they would normally command. So many of the first editions I've bought in recent years were ex-library, because I can't afford it's not that I can't afford it, but I'd rather spend the money on Space Command, and other things that I think are more value. I don't need a first edition Hemingway. I mean, I've got a first edition Time Machine that I bought when I turned 40, and that's one of my prized possessions. But I'm not looking to get $1,000 or $2,000 books anymore.
Right. That's a very good 40th birthday present.
Yeah, it was great. I went to London. Yeah. Elaine and I went to London, and we met with one of the great H.G. Wells experts, and he took us to his place, and it was filled with books, and he had all these different first editions of Wells, and I bought The Time Machine. I bought a couple of other books too, and this is, for instance, right here, this is the American first edition of First Man in the Moon. You really can't see it. Let's see if I can. Yeah, it's hard to see in the. There you go, First Man in the Moon. This is the American first. But the funny thing, the reason I put books in plastic in plastic bags is because, as I mentioned before, we're in earthquake territory, and if the books fall, if they're not in plastic, the spines break, and if they are in plastic, the spines don't break. So that's why I do that. So just to let everyone know my idiosyncrasies.
Very good.
So, yeah.
We don't want to take up too much of your time, so just a few more questions.
Sure, you bet.
Doc Sigmier asks, I remember when people were laughing about sound in space, aka Star Wars, yes, but it was very effective on film. Your take?
You know, I love things like 2001 that don't have sound in space, and I love things that do. I mean, you know, Star Trek kind of, you know, JJ tried to split the difference and have sound inside the Enterprise, and then when it gets vented, people are sucked out into space and it goes silent, which was cool. But you know, again, in Space Command, we have sound in space just because it's more exciting, it's more dramatic. It's not a big deal. I mean, you know, if we were doing a documentary, I would have no sound in space, of course. And, you know, and obviously if it's a vacuum, you know, people aren't taking off their helmets and walking around, you know, no one is sniffing the air and saying, well, I can breathe this, you know, none of that, you know, but, so I try to be accurate when it matters in terms of story. And then if I can't afford to do it, like 0G, things like that, I don't do it. I come up with a technological, you know, excuse for how we're doing stuff. So, you know, that's the main part of it. Hang on 1 second. There you go. Okay, great. Other questions? And
another question from Simon Kennedy. Mm-hmm. What do you think of out there sci-fi like Cyberpunk classic Tetsuo from 1989?
Yeah,
Iron Man.
I haven't really gotten into that yet. Of course, with Cyberpunk, I love Blade Runner. That's one of my favorites, of course. And you know, so it's, but I must say, I tend to like stories that have a happy ending. That's just my bias. And if it's dark, or if the message is, well, you're screwed no matter what you do, I mean, that's why I don't really like noir films that much, with a few exceptions. I love Double Indemnity. It's a great film. But you know, I like upbeat things because my own life has been upbeat, and I'm living a wonderful life, and I've got love in my life and work that matters to me. And so I like my work to reflect my view of the world. And I think the world can be made better by our efforts. And you know, so I haven't gravitated toward really dark nihilistic stuff, but you never know what the next day will bring in terms of what I'll be reading.
Great. Wonderful. And I'm just going to do one more question.
Sure.
From Christopher Cole, who asks, when writing Far Beyond the Stars, did you reach out to DC Fontana or any other early sci-fi writer who would have been overlooked?
I actually spoke at length with Harlan Ellison. He had done a recording on cassette that I'd gotten, where he reminisced for an hour about writing for the magazines in the 50s. And that was very inspirational. It had a lot to what inspired me to do Far Beyond the Stars. And so when I was outlining it, I called Harlan. I asked him some very specific questions. For instance, I asked him if there were any Black writers who were writing under white pseudonyms in science fiction. And he said no, but there was one writer who was mainstream who was doing that. And he told me about him. It's someone he'd known. And that was very interesting. But the great part was that Harlan, I'd had my ups and downs with Harlan over the years, and he was very embittered against Star Trek, but he was kind enough, even knowing I was writing a new episode of Star Trek, to be very generous with answering my questions. And I mean, I loved Harlan. He was terrific. And as temperamental as he was, as difficult as he could sometimes be, there was only one of him, and I really miss the fact that he's not with us anymore. He was terrific. He was, I think, more than any other writer, he's the reason I'm a writer today. And so, he was terrific, and that was very great. It was very gracious of him to share his knowledge with me when I was coming up with that episode. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you again,
Sure.
Mark.
Yes.
Always a pleasure talking with you and
You
getting
bet.
these questions answered.
Yeah.
And I want to thank everyone watching.
Thanks, guys.
All the fans of Space Command and the new fans of Space Command and the old fans as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and just in closing, you know, we're working on Ripple Effect. You'll be able to see very, very soon. I think you'll really love it. And then the second hour of the pilot is getting completed. I'm getting visual effects shots every day, and it's moving along. So I'm thrilled. This is all thanks to you guys. And again, if you want to help in any way, we love that. And if you want to buy more shares in Space Command and get this terrific alien, one-of-a-kind creature, which is incredibly cool and scary. My dog was barking at it and growling at it, and I had to like take it to the dog and have the dog sniff it and say, "See, it's not a monster." But and by the way, my dogs, Rudy and Eve, my terriers, have a major role in Ripple Effect in the new episode. So it will be definitely the scene you all talk about. So so not just Star Trek has dogs. Yeah. So great. Well, thanks very much for taking the time to ask me questions, guys. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate your support and encouragement. And you know, we'll be posting often here on Mr. Sci-Fi, and you know, thanks. Spread the word. Let people know about us. And if you haven't seen the full hour of the pilot, just go to the greatest Star Trek series you're not watching. It's a few videos back, and I think you'll really love it. So thanks, guys, and we'll talk soon. Bye. Great. Okay.